Well, hi everyone. Greetings from somewhere down there in the Southern Hemisphere. We're coming to you today from southeastern Australia in the city of Melbourne, Naarm in Victoria. My name is Dr. Paul Satur. I'm a lecturer for water sensitive cities at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I'm joined with Dr. Katie O'Brien from the Monash Law Faculty and Dr. Paul Kellner from Behaviour Works Australia, and Miss Jo Kane from Melbourne Water. And we're delighted to be here today to share with you some recent work we have undertaken together in developing a framework for community-focused diversity inclusion in livability-related service delivery at Melbourne Water. This has been a transdisciplinary piece of research, and we'll be outlining for you today the kind of strategic context in which it came about and the work that was done between this broad research team and Melbourne Water and the sort of findings and next steps that have come from it. Before I begin, I do want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands in which we're meeting. And for me here today in Naarm, Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to acknowledge the elders past and present, and further extend that acknowledgement to traditional owners on the lands throughout the greater Melbourne region in which this work touches, and furthermore to those throughout Australia and internationally, both joining us here today and joining us in time through this recording. I will hand to you, Jo, to begin by setting the context within Melbourne Water that has led to this work being developed.
Thank you, Paul, and hello everyone. Thanks for having us here. So Melbourne Water are committed to enhancing life and livability for the greater Melbourne region. As caretakers for Melbourne's water cycle, we care for water, life and land throughout Melbourne, both its people and biodiversity. We plan for and manage all elements of the water cycle for today, tomorrow and generations to come, including providing clean drinking water, treating sewage so we can recover and reuse our valued resources, planning to prevent flooding and keeping Melbourne's rivers, creeks and catchments healthy. We are also a key figure in the planning and delivery of Melbourne's livability, overseeing over 33,000 hectares of land and 25,000 kilometres of waterway corridors used for place-based outcomes for the enhancement of people, cultures and environments. Melbourne Water is driven by a strategic vision that places livability and therefore accessibility at the centre of everything we do. Thank you, Paul. Melbourne Water's current diversity and inclusion strategy created an enabling environment to make substantial progress around intersectionality and also an expansion into applying a diversity and inclusion lens to both the internal workplace, but also outwards towards our external and community aspects of our work and service delivery. This is supportive of our customer value, livability, safety and customer first principles, and our three core values of courage, care and integrity. Our strategic vision aims to improve customer and community and customer solutions through a deeper understanding of their needs, role model inclusive leadership in the workplace, and seek to positively influence how community services delivered through understanding the diverse needs of our community. In 2019, Melbourne Water set out to internally increase awareness about the emerging need for a greater focus to be placed on what it meant for Melbourne Water to create livability outcomes and multiple benefits from our land and waterways in a more granular, humanistic and holistic way. This would be to ensure they were created in a way that provided more opportunities for all our community to experience the nature and well-being benefit we can work with others to provide. Further, this would not only help Melbourne Water meet external obligations and requirements, but this new external community-focused diversity and inclusion lens had strong internal strategic alignment to our strategies, direction and vision, including our livability attributes of sense of place and sense of community. Melbourne Water's current business plan draws clear alignment of sustainable development goals. Both future commitments and current actions describe the importance for greater connection, collaboration and ongoing partnerships with diverse community subsets, including those traditionally less heard, such as women, vulnerable communities, people with disabilities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, landholders, and private institutions. After some internal awareness raising workshops, we identified our next step was to undertake some foundational work that would create and underpin principles by which Melbourne Water could apply a community-focused diversity and inclusion lens to our service delivery. Resulting from this was the creation of a collaborative transdisciplinary research partnership with Monash University. I'll hand over to you now, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. So a desire to go beyond best practice strategically in diversity and inclusion, to think about this challenge of embedding livability and optimizing it through diversity and inclusion was really the context in which this research emerged. A big part of this was to understand, well, what would this mean in practice, which is to say in the work that is undertaken throughout Melbourne Water with its many stakeholders, its diverse communities, its different partners in government, in the private sector and industry and traditional owners. How could we harness diversity and inclusion? And as you'll see here on screen, there are a number of different touch points when it comes to embedding livability that diversity and inclusion could tap into. And this was an initial finding that actually came out of our work. We identified that there was a really vast array of different ways that this could look and work. So to unpack this question, we drew together a diverse interdisciplinary research team with skills in water law, legislation and policy, water systems governance and empowerment, gender equality and social inclusion, evidence synthesis and behaviour change, and public health and safety, but wanted to ensure that any outcomes that were developed from the research, any knowledge that was produced, was done so with and alongside the organisation, its staff, and within the operating environment to support a knowledge development approach and the synthesis of working outcomes for anything that was produced in this work, which is why there was a transdisciplinary research approach developed. So the first phase of this work was to go, well, what would it actually look like? What could we mean by bringing together diversity and inclusion with livability-based service delivery? And to begin unpacking this question, there were three initial review processes undertaken. The first, a comprehensive review of international evidence and research to really look at what examples are out there. How could this look? How could we take things that are done already and think about them within the Melbourne Water operating context? Second, a comprehensive review of existing legislation and regulatory and policy-based materials at state and federal and international levels to think about what are Melbourne Water's key operating requirements? What are their legislative obligations and responsibilities, and how do we make sure that this work really picks up on those requirements? Then finally, some work to understand, well, looking at the evidence, looking at the legal context, how do we align this aspiration with the existing strategic priorities within the organisation? And to do that, we did a comprehensive review across the operating environment of different policies, strategies and action plans, including an analysis of key risk and safety outcomes to consider this, alignment and consider the sort of context in which we're working in. This led to a series of co-design workshops within the organisation to begin developing and in the process embedding this concept throughout the organisation. And we'll come to that in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to hand to you, Katie, to share some insights from the legal legislative review process.
Thanks, Paul. Well, the first thing that I did in terms of the legislative review was to identify the main laws that have some bearing on diversity and inclusion. And these were both state and federal laws, and also had a bit of a look at the state policy context. And the policy context at the time included such things as the State Disability Plan, the Gender Equality Strategy, and the Aboriginal Affairs Framework. Now, in terms of the legislation, at the federal level, these included the Sex Discrimination Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, the Age Discrimination Act, and the Racial Discrimination Act. There's actually very similar legislation at the state level, but at the state level, we've also got the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Now, it was quite clear that the policy context and legislation were all supportive of a culture of diversity and inclusion. And just by way of example, Victoria's Disability Act has as its first objective being to advance the inclusion and participation in the community of persons with a disability. Now, there are sanctions for acting in a discriminatory manner in the provision of goods and services, but what was clear was that there are only a few positive things that Melbourne Water are required to do to promote diversity and inclusion, such as preparing a disability action plan and a gender impact assessment, along with some reporting requirements. Now, there are no specific sanctions in the legislation if Melbourne Water doesn't get around to preparing the disability action plan or gender impact assessment. The only way to get them to do so would be to take them to court and to get a court order to compel their preparation. Now, the upshot of all of this is that the legislation largely relies on Melbourne Water to promote diversity and inclusion by encouraging a cultural shift rather than the application of sanctions. And now I'll hand over to Paul Kellner.
Thanks, Katie. So I'll just quickly run through a few bits and bobs related to the evidence review that myself and a team of expert reviewers undertook. So we explored the question, what works to promote community diversity and inclusion within land and waterway management? So really looking for those examples that Paul Satur was mentioning earlier. We screened 2,800 titles and abstracts to land on one review and 11 primary studies. And really the headline was that we didn't find any examples that would really perfectly translate to this particular context. So much of this review really focuses on cross-cutting messages that we learned from synthesizing our learnings. And I'll just highlight a few of the top ones here in this list. So first off, choosing and employing suitable participation methods is really important. So making sure that engagement takes place in an appropriate way in the right format is really critical. Also, anchoring participation in organizational approaches and municipal strategies. So aligning your work with the relevant strategies and approaches. And then also continuously supporting users and evaluating ongoing participation. So that's really about being data-driven in learning and learning in an ongoing and continuous way. So back to Paul Satur.
Thanks, Paul K. So with the need to compel the organisation in culture and practice, yet not necessarily a clear roadmap. These findings then led to a series of workshops, as I mentioned, to bring the organisation together, to think through a concept for diversity inclusion in livability and the way this could be applied within Melbourne Water's operating context, drawing on the sorts of knowledge that had been generated from these review processes to date. And where we landed was here. The concept of community, diversity, and inclusion, one where Melbourne Water values the unique qualities of the community they work with and the context that they work in, and ensures that the sorts of opportunities that they deliver are for all people to experience, which is to say that all people have the opportunity to experience and participate in enhancing life and livability. And within the organisation, 4 key principles that underpin what this work would look like in supporting greater access for everyone, human rights and reconciliation, ensuring these are upheld in the day-to-day work that is done, embracing diversity in people and places, and ensuring healthy and safe people and places as well. So with this concept and principles, the next step of this work was to think through, well, what would this look like in our work? If we were to take these and apply them today, what might it mean? And what are the challenges for us to do this? And from our conversations already, it was clear that there were many moving parts in this very large organisation and the need to think through carefully about the interacting systemic parts of this organisation that would enable it to function effectively. So to do this, we really began exploring 4 key components of the organisation in its implementation and operating context, how things are done on the ground, for example, the broader strategic policy and planning context that sits around implementation, and then, of course, the organisational culture and key enablers, so the sorts of knowledge, expectation, values that the organisation holds, the sorts of tools, skill sets, capabilities, the leadership environment, and how these things effectively come together in a systematised way to support the sort of work that is being done. This second phase of work began to unpack these 4 areas through 2 approaches. The first, a series of comprehensive focus groups or semi-structured interviews with different parts of the organisation to really understand how this looked from different parts of that organisation operating chain. What does it look like? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And the sorts of questions we were asking were, things, as you can see in these large outer circles. What sort of vision would you hold for something like community, diversity, inclusion? What sort of critical planning and strategic requirements are inherent to what you do, and how would they align to a vision of this kind? What sort of values and expectations do you see in it? Do you think are important? Do you have already or currently don't have that you think you might need? And then finally, what sort of action, what sort of resources, trainings, and tools do you see as important in your part of this organization to make this work? Phase 2 was then about bringing that, broader environment together through a series of cross-organizational workshops that would enable teams to talk and communicate with one another to start to look at this broader systemic picture that was being established, and think through carefully through a series of scenarios that we developed from these initial conversations as to how this could look. So I wanted to share with you a couple of quotes which we feel really captures the aspiration in terms of what we were finding. Firstly, a really strong enthusiasm and culture already within the organization for diversity and inclusion, but a recognition that this will need to be strengthened both in terms of the culture itself and the practice by pulling this towards us. And you can see from the top left-hand corner, it needs to be a priority. We need to pull it towards us. We need to work out how we can make our internal environment do this. We don't necessarily have a legislative obligation to do it. At the same time, recognizing that Melbourne Water is an organisation responsible for waterways, for major water service providers, in terms of stepping into this new domain of livability and diversity and inclusion, there is a need, to connect throughout Melbourne Water's vast networks, its stakeholders, its communities, its different traditional owner organisations, for example, as well as diversity, inclusion support and knowledge brokers to help build this capacity. So this concept of looking inwards to look outwards really came to fruition. Looking inwards to pull this towards us, embracing challenges like building organisational capacities, supporting cultural growth and leadership, addressing institutional lock-ins and path dependencies, and understanding resourcing and trade-offs in terms of how we manage diversity and inclusion alongside ecological preservation, alongside public health and safety, for example. At the same time, a requirement to look outwards, to connect, to listen, learn, and embed throughout the broader Melbourne Water operating environment, throughout its networks and communities, connecting meaningfully with different rights holders, stakeholders, and community, supporting integrated servicing outcomes with a number of partners that have a role to play in shaping Melbourne's livability. These were some of the key challenges that were identified, and some of those that are talked about in a recent principles of best practice that was developed as part of this work. I'm going to hand to you now, Jo, to talk a little bit about how this document has been used throughout the organisation so far.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. So how are we making use of the research so far? Well, we're referencing the report and its findings in our external funding applications for co-delivery of accessible and inclusive community outcomes. We're using this work as a solid foundation for developing gender impact assessments and in provoking thought, highlighting opportunities and ideas for practical suggestions at a strategic program and project level. We've begun incorporating our CD&I principles of practice into project-based site discussions, identifying opportunities and concept designs, and education facility uplifts and more. We're influencing internally and external with potential co-design and co-delivery partners, and we're promoting our report alongside other tools for inclusive engagement. We're also using it as for planning for our strategic next steps in this space. Thank you, Paul.
Oh, yeah. And then lastly, I'll just jump in and talk about some of our thinking since this report has been completed. And in the interest of time, I'll be quite brief. I'll just mention that we've been thinking about water authorities as potentially anchor institutions. So for those unfamiliar with the concept, large, typically nonprofit public sector organizations whose long-term sustainability is tied to the well-being of populations that they serve. And probably the most critical element of this idea is that they leverage the not only economic resources and capital, but also physical, social, political, and other forms of power and capital. And in the interest of time, again, I think I'll gloss over these examples, but I'm sure it can be clear that those ideas are very related to what we've been discussing. So Jo, would you like to finish us off?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So we're in the decade that matters. Our sector is facing big challenges, including long-term water security, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, improving the health of our rivers and catchments, and making our cities an even better place to live. We will now need to leverage a broader perspective on what we are here to do to continue supporting community resilience and public health. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. And thank you, Katie and Paul. That wraps up the work we were going to share with you today. A big thank you for having us, and thanks to the conference conveners and organisers for what will be and has been a fantastic few days of discussion. We'd really love to hear your thoughts on this work, so please do reach out either immediately after or in the future via email. Thanks again, and look forward to catching up.